The day my parents kicked me out with a suitcase was the day the lottery hit. By dawn, I was rich, but no one knew. Not my parents, who locked the door behind me like I was some rebellious teenager who needed to be punished. Not my brother, who stood in the hallway watching like a stranger. Not even me, at first, because when you've just been thrown out by the people who raised you, soaked in rain, clutching a suitcase like your entire life can fit into it, you don't think of miracles, you think of survival. My name is Lana Condor. I'm 29. I was born and raised in Claremont, a suburb just outside Seattle where the lawns are manicured, the fences are white, and the expectations are quietly suffocating. My father, Dr. Michael Condor, is a neurosurgeon with a mind wired for logic and a heart calibrated for achievement. My mother, Evelyn, is a corporate strategist who schedules affection between meetings and wears success like perfume, meant to impress but never overpower. They raised me with precision, top schools, summer internships, etiquette classes, and a career path mapped out before I even had a favorite color. They didn't mean to be cruel, but in our home, love was a transaction and worth was tied to performance. I was supposed to go into medicine like Dad or business like Mom. I tried. I really did. I earned a marketing degree, got a job at a healthcare startup, wore pencil skirts and answered emails at midnight, but none of it fit. My soul always belonged to something softer, something stranger, textiles. I'd fallen in love with fabrics when I was 8, watching my grandmother stitch stories into quilts no one read after she passed. I kept her old sewing machine and taught myself the language of threads, while my parents praised my LinkedIn endorsements. I spent weekends designing hand-woven scarves, dyed with natural pigments, textured like memory. I called my side project Driftloom, my secret rebellion. I sold on Etsy under a pseudonym, and each month the sales trickled in, just enough to whisper maybe. I never expected their approval, but I didn't expect betrayal. 3 weeks ago, I finally gathered the courage to tell them I was leaving my job. I had saved for 6 months, landed a local artisan grant, and found a shared studio space downtown. I presented it like a business plan costs, projections, a lean marketing strategy. I was proud, nervous, but proud. My mother barely blinked. You're turning your back on stability for a hobby. My father folded his arms. Scarves don't pay for health care. I reminded them I wasn't asking for money, just support or silence. Instead, I got an ultimatum. If you walk away from this opportunity, you walk away from this house. It was said so cleanly, so clinically, like firing an employee. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just quiet, irreversible exile. I left that night, not out of drama, out of dignity. I packed what I could, 3 outfits, my sewing kit, a box of pigment powders, and a velvet pouch with my grandmother's lucky charm. The suitcase wasn't even mine. It was one my parents kept for weekend golf trips. As I stepped into the night, the rain had already begun. I called friends, no answer. Out of town. Too cramped. I wandered to the old train station by Franklin Street, sat on a cold bench, and stared at my reflection in the vending machine window. I looked like someone who had failed, and maybe I had. I pulled out my phone just to distract myself, thumb hovering over the usual apps. I tapped the Washington State Lottery icon out of habit, not hope. It was something Grandma and I used to do for fun. She always said the numbers didn't matter, it was the belief. I still used her birthday combination. The app was slow. Maybe it was the rain or my shaking hands. But when the numbers finally loaded, I blinked. EO4, 17, 28, 33, 42, 10. My pulse spiked. I pulled out my folded paper ticket from my wallet, smoothed it out, and checked again. Match, 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 all 6. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe. The screen confirmed. Congratulations. You've won. I stared at the message, hollow. It felt like a prank, like a test. I didn't feel rich. I felt cold, abandoned, alone. But something shifted in that moment. A quiet click inside my chest. I had nothing left to lose. And now, I had more than anyone imagined. No one knew where I was. No one knew what I held. And I wasn't about to tell them. Not yet. By the time the sun began to rise, I was still sitting there, numb on that damp metal bench, clutching a paper ticket that could buy back my entire life 100 times over. But I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was no music swelling in the background. No dramatic movie moment where everything snapped into place. All I felt was silence, the kind that comes after a betrayal so deep it rewires your sense of home. The kind that leaves you wondering how people who claim to love you can look you in the eye and still turn the lock behind you. I didn't tell anyone, not Amber, my best friend who would have probably screamed and cried and forced me to take a private jet to Mexico. Not the stranger at the counter of the all-night diner where I stopped for a lukewarm coffee and the smallest breakfast I could order. I paid in cash, kept the receipt. I watched the people around me with a strange sense of detachment, like I had crossed over into a new layer of reality where nothing made sense but everything was suddenly possible. I booked a motel room under the name L.C., Tran, a name I'd used once for a college art show when I wanted my work judged without bias. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions, just handed me a key and said checkout was at 11. I locked the door behind me, sank onto the bed, and stared at the ceiling. My parents didn't know. They had pushed me out believing they were teaching me a lesson, believing I'd crawl back embarrassed and broken, begging for forgiveness I didn't owe. But instead of crawling, I was about to fly. I just didn't know how yet. I spent the next 2 hours reading everything I could about how to claim a lottery prize anonymously. Washington State didn't require names to be made public if the claim was done through a legal trust. I wrote down attorney names. I searched financial advisors. I made lists, not of things to buy, but of decisions to make. I wasn't going to blow this. I wasn't going to post it online or flaunt it or turn it into some flashy revenge. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. I found a lawyer, someone who specialized in asset protection, and set a consultation for the next day. I stayed off social media. I turned off location tracking. I moved with the quiet focus of someone who had just escaped a fire and was still coughing up smoke. And in those hours alone, the anger crept in, not the hot, explosive kind, the cold kind, the kind that builds silently, brick by brick, as you remember the details that shouldn't be forgivable, the way my mother looked at me like I was disposable, the way my father said good luck without even offering a ride, the silence from my brother, standing by, choosing comfort over conscience, that suitcase, the one they gave me without a second thought, still sat in the corner of the motel room. I hadn't unpacked it. I didn't need to, because everything I had packed came from belief, not permission. Every item in that bag was something I had chosen, something I had created, something they would never understand, and that was their loss, not mine. The next morning, I showed up to the lawyer's office in the same jeans and hoodie I'd worn when I left home. No one looked twice. He walked me through the process. A blind trust. Legal separation from the name on the check. A plan for tax liability, investment structure, donation strategy. It all felt surreal, like building a fortress no one else could see. I signed the forms. I opened new accounts. I chose a business name. Driftloom would go from underground brand to a full creative studio. But first, I needed distance, space to breathe. I booked a short-term rental in a converted artist loft on the east side of the city, the kind of place with high ceilings, creaky wood floors, and windows that let in morning light like permission. No furniture, no internet, just silence. I brought only my tools, my laptop, and the velvet pouch holding the lottery ticket. I taped that ticket to the back of my closet door and told myself this was not my savior, it was my accelerant. My work still had to speak for itself, and so, for days, I worked from dawn until night. I designed, cut, dyed, and stitched. I reshot my entire product line, rewrote my brand story, relaunched my site under my real name. I created a small batch collection that felt like me, not the version that begged for approval, but the version that made peace with rejection, the version that didn't need a family to validate her worth. I remember holding my breath when the first sale came through, then the second, then an order from a boutique in Montreal asking about a wholesale partnership. It wasn't the lottery money that made me feel rich. It was that moment of being seen on my own terms. My parents still didn't know, but they would. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew eventually they'd come looking, not for me, for the story, for the explanation behind the life I was quietly building. The success they would assume came from luck, never labor. But I was ready for that conversation, because by then, I'd already learned the truth being underestimated is exhausting, but being self-made is something no one can take from you. The first time I saw my name printed on the return label of a Drifloom package, I stared at it longer than necessary. Lana Condor. Not just the model or the marketer or the obedient daughter, but the maker, the founder, the woman who stitched every thread, wrote every caption, packed every order in that moment under the yellow light of my small studio kitchen. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, quiet pride, not the kind handed down from authority figures, not the conditional approval I used to chase, but something deeper, like I had earned my own name back. Orders began to pick up faster than I expected. At first, I thought it was a fluke. Then a fashion blogger in New York wore one of my hand-dyed infinity scarves in a viral fall lookbook and tagged me without warning. My inbox exploded. The timing felt surreal, but it wasn't magic. I had been building this for 5 years in the shadows. The lottery didn't make me talented. It just gave me a chance to work like I believed I was. Still, I kept everything low. No social photos of my face, no mentions of the lottery, no press. The money was being invested carefully, split across blind trusts, growing quietly. I was still living simply. Same boots, same grocery store. No one could look at me and guess I had millions sitting untouched. That was the point. I didn't want to look rich. I wanted to become free. Then came the message. It was from my brother, Ethan. We hadn't spoken since the night I left. His text was short. Mom says you're doing well. Where are you? No question about how I'd been, no apology, just a gentle fishing line, sent on behalf of people too proud to speak to me directly. I didn't reply. Not yet. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I needed them to sit in the silence they created. What they didn't know was that I had already paid off every penny of Grandma's old mortgage, the one they refused to co-sign for when she got sick. I had also anonymously donated under Driftloom to the art scholarship fund she started before she passed. Her name was now permanently etched on a plaque outside the local textile school. That meant more to me than anything my family had ever given me. I moved into a new space 2 weeks later, a sunlit loft overlooking the Fremont Bridge. It was open, minimal, but full of light. I finally bought a proper loom and a sewing table that didn't wobble. I hired a part-time assistant named Elise, a design student working nights to pay for her degree. She reminded me of who I used to be: hungry, hopeful, underestimated. I didn't tell her anything about the money. She didn't need to know. What mattered was that we worked, that the product was real, that we were building something together. One night, I received a handwritten letter slid under my building's front door. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. It was brief. She said she hoped I was safe, that she had heard whispers of me doing something with textiles, that they were sorry for how harsh things got. No signature, no return address. Just a folded apology, half swallowed by pride. I read it twice, then tucked it into a book I kept beside my bed. Not because I forgave her, but because I knew she had never written anything like that before. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The next day, I got an unexpected email from a senior buyer at Indigo Row, a well-known boutique in San Francisco. She had seen my line featured in an online magazine's 10 undiscovered designers list and wanted to schedule a call. I replied with a calm, "Thank you," hiding the shake in my hands. That was the moment the switch flipped. Not the lottery, not the orders, that email. The realization that someone who didn't know me, didn't owe me, saw value in what I made, not in who my parents were, not in my resume, just in the work. The following week, I closed Drift Loom's first wholesale contract. I didn't celebrate with champagne or photos. I celebrated by hand-delivering Elise her first paycheck and a new sewing kit with her name engraved. I told her she'd be lead designer by next year if she kept showing up. She cried. I didn't. I'd already cried enough to flood every floor I'd ever lived on. It was around that time I stopped checking my parents' social accounts. I didn't need to know what they were thinking, or whether they had figured anything out. I knew eventually they'd hear from someone. They'd connect the dots. Maybe they already had, but by then, it wouldn't matter, because by then, I wouldn't need anything from them. My revenge wasn't going to be a dramatic speech or a viral post. It was going to be a storefront, a sold-out collection, a team of women who once thought they had to choose between survival and creativity. It was going to be the quiet power of building something beautiful without permission. And when they did show up again, I'd be ready not to retaliate, but to let them see what they lost the moment they packed my dreams into a suitcase and called it discipline. The first sign that my parents were paying attention came not through a phone call or a visit, but through a former neighbor named Mrs. Harper. She ran into me outside a small artisan market where I had set up a Drift Loom pop-up booth. I was helping Elise arrange the display when I heard her voice behind me, half curious and half sweet. "Lana, is that really you?" She looked at me like she had just spotted a celebrity in the produce aisle. I smiled politely and nodded. She glanced at the booth, at the printed logo, the polished lookbook on the table, and then narrowed her eyes the way older women do when they've heard gossip but want confirmation. "Your mother mentioned you were doing something with fabric. She wasn't very clear, but this looks successful." She said the word like it was fragile. I simply thanked her and offered her a sample card. No explanations, no stories. I wasn't going to give her anything to report back. If my parents were going to hear about my life, it wasn't going to be through whispers. It would be from me, when I was ready, that night. I opened my inbox and saw a message from an editor at Modern Artisan, a digital magazine that featured emerging design studios. They wanted to profile Drift Loom for their upcoming issue on sustainable textile brands. I stared at the screen. unsure whether to laugh or cry. 2 years ago, I couldn't get anyone to even follow my shop page. Now they wanted a feature. I said yes, but asked to remain visually anonymous for the time being. Let the work speak. Let the name grow. Keep the personal out of it, at least for now. The article came out a week later, and within 24 hours, site traffic tripled. The press called my aesthetic grounded, warm, and emblematic of a new wave of thoughtful fashion. It was the first time anyone had described my work without comparing it to someone else's. Not like so-and-so. Not reminds me of, just mine. Meanwhile, I received another text from Ethan, this time longer. He said Mom had been acting strange, checking her phone obsessively, asking questions about design schools. Dad apparently brought my name up during a dinner with their family friends, speculating I was working for a big label under the table. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the Modern Artisan link to an old friend who had always supported my work quietly. She posted it, tagged me. I knew it wouldn't be long before someone sent it to them. The truth wasn't something I wanted to weaponize, but I wasn't going to hide it anymore either. 2 days later, my phone rang. Private number. I didn't answer. A voicemail came through. My mother. Her voice was more measured than I expected. She said she hoped I was well, that she had read something online that sounded like me, and that she missed me. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No mention of the suitcase, the rain, the silence, just surface concern. It would have broken me once, but now it barely registered. I listened to it twice, not because I was hoping for warmth, but because I was analyzing the distance. That voicemail wasn't for me. It was for her own conscience, and maybe for the version of me she wished she still controlled. The turning point came not from them, but from someone I used to intern with at my old job. Her name was Rachel, and she now worked for a tech company that had just launched a creative grant for women in sustainable fashion. She messaged me saying Driftloom was being nominated internally. She didn't know about my story, just the brand. That was how I knew it was real. That was how I knew I had finally stepped into a different lane, one not built on family reputation or polished resumes, but on real effort, real craft, and decisions no one else understood at the time. I accepted the nomination quietly. I didn't attend the award dinner, but Elise did. She wore one of our original hand-woven coats and spoke about the power of women funding women. A photo of her speech later appeared in a local paper. My mother clipped the article and mailed it to me without a note. Just the page, folded carefully, with my company name highlighted. It wasn't love, but maybe it was the closest she knew how to get. And in the quiet after all that, I realized something important. I didn't need them to say we were wrong. I didn't even need them to apologize. What I needed was exactly what I had earned: space to grow, to fail, to rise again. I no longer looked at their approval as a door I needed to reopen. I had built my own door, my own room, my own nameplate. When people ask what changed my life, I never say the lottery. That was a spark, but the fire was already burning. The thing that changed my life was walking away when it hurt the most, when no one believed in me, and still deciding to keep going anyway. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind where the light hits just right through the windows and everything feels a little too quiet. Elise had stepped out for lunch, and I was midway through steaming fabric swatches when the intercom buzzed. I rarely got unexpected visitors. The building had a front gate, and most deliveries came through the back. I walked over, pressed the button, and heard the last voice I expected. "Lana, it's Dad. We're downstairs." For a second I froze, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. I hadn't seen either of them in over 8 months. No texts, no apologies. Just that voicemail my mom left months ago and a clipped article mailed like a peace offering without context. And now, suddenly, they were at my door. I buzzed them in without a word. I didn't do it for them. I did it for me, because I wasn't hiding anymore. They walked in like they didn't know if they belonged there. My father still in his tailored suit. My mother holding her purse like a shield. They stood in the center of my studio, eyes scanning the room as if trying to find something they could understand. I offered them tea. They declined. It wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. My mother spoke first. She said they had been meaning to come by for a while, but didn't know how. She said they'd read the articles, seen the photos, heard from friends who were suddenly full of praise for the daughter they once wrote off. My father didn't say much. He kept looking at my work like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Finally, he said, "This is impressive." I said thank you, not with sarcasm, not with warmth, just as fact. He asked how long it had taken to build. I told him it started 5 years ago, in the corner of a bedroom they once called a phase. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask them why they threw me out. I didn't need to. But here's the thing about success built from scratch. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't crave validation. It just exists. And the people who once ignored it don't get to reshape the story. My mother reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside was my grandmother's thimble, the one I thought had been lost when they cleaned out her house. She said she'd found it in a drawer and thought I should have it. For a moment, that touched me. But then I remembered how they refused to let me keep anything from Grandma's sewing room after she died. They said it was sentimental clutter, and now here they were. Handing, I looked them both in the eye and said the one thing I had been rehearsing for months. You kicked me out to teach me a lesson, but the lesson wasn't what you think. I didn't learn that dreams were foolish. I learned that people can disappoint you and you'll still survive. I learned how to build without applause, and I learned that the only approval that matters is your own. My mother blinked, visibly shaken. My father cleared his throat but didn't respond. I continued. You wanted me to come back crawling. Instead, I stood up taller than I ever have. You assumed I would fail. Instead, I've succeeded in ways you never even asked about. The silence in the room stretched until it almost cracked. Then my father asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell us about the lottery?" I smiled. Because that was what it was always going to come down to. Not the art, not the discipline, not the growth, the money. I answered calmly. Because you would have assumed that's why I made it. You would have told yourselves that my success wasn't real, that it was just luck. But I made sure every part of Driftloom grew before a single dollar. They didn't argue, not because they agreed, but because they finally understood I wasn't someone they could debate anymore. My mother asked if we could start again. I told her we could start honest. That meant boundaries. That meant no pretending the past didn't happen. That meant before they left. My father paused at one of the framed prints on the wall, a quote I'd had hand-lettered by a local artist. It read, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." He looked at me, then at the quote, and nodded. He didn't say it. But when the door closed behind them, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like everything I had built was now anchored, because I had faced the very people who once believed I would fold under pressure, and I hadn't folded. I had formed. A week after they visited my studio, I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I let it ring out. Then another came through, and then a third, when I finally picked up. It was a woman from a local business publication. She said she was working on a feature about up-and-coming entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest and had heard about Driftloom. She asked if she could come by the studio for an interview and photo shoot. I told her I'd think about it. But when she mentioned that my mother had spoken very proudly about my work at a recent charity brunch, I felt something twist in my chest. I thanked her, said I wasn't doing press at the moment, and ended the call. Then I just stood there in the center of the room, fists clenched, because now I understood. Now that the brand had traction, now that I had press, awards, even minor celebrity interest, my parents were ready to reframe the narrative. Suddenly, I was their daughter again, the successful one, the independent one, the visionary. They were proud now, because other people were, and that was the part that hit hardest, not the abandonment, not the insults, but the way they tried to fold me back into their story like I had never left, like the suitcase, the rain, the silence hadn't happened, like they hadn't kicked me out thinking I would fall apart. They had no interest in the parts of the journey that were lonely, scrappy, and uncertain, only the polished finish, the part that looked good on paper and sounded good at cocktail parties. I realized in that moment that people like them only value the final product, never the process. They celebrate outcomes, not growth. They understand success only when it can be measured, displayed, or used as social currency. That weekend, I drove out to a small town near Olympia where a textile conference was being held. Elise was speaking on a panel about emerging sustainability techniques, and I wanted to support her without distracting from her spotlight. I sat in the back, unrecognized, listening to her speak about Driftloom's mission, our use of natural dyes, our commitment to ethical sourcing. She spoke with the kind of conviction that made me proud in ways I didn't have words for. After the panel, a student approached her and asked how the brand had started. Elise said, "It started in a bedroom with one woman and a vision no one believed in." She didn't name me. She didn't need to. On the drive back, I thought a lot about legacy, what it means, who gets to shape it. I had once believed legacy came from family. Now I understood it comes from impact, from action, from building something that outlives your own name. I didn't need my parents' approval to validate my work. I needed to stay true to the reason I started it in the first place, not for praise, but for people like Elise, like me, people who had been told their ideas were impractical, their paths too unstable, their visions too unclear. When I got home, I found a letter waiting in my mailbox, handwritten, again, no return address. But this one was different. It was from my father. He wrote that he had read every article, watched every feature, and still didn't understand how I'd done it. He admitted that part of him wanted to take credit, to say that he had raised someone resilient. But he couldn't, because resilience isn't something you inherit. It's something you forge. He wrote that he was sorry, truly sorry, for not seeing it earlier, for thinking structure was more important than spirit, for not realizing that the very thing he tried to stifle was the very thing that made me unstoppable. I read that letter 3 times. It didn't fix everything, but it did something, not because it erased what happened, but because it didn't try to. He didn't ask to meet, didn't ask for a favor, didn't even ask for forgiveness. He just told the truth, quietly. And finally, that night, I sat at my loom longer than usual. I started weaving a new design, something with layers of deep blue and soft gray, inspired by the Pacific coast. I called it Storm Memory. It wasn't a tribute to them. It was a tribute to the version of me that walked out into the rain, suitcase in hand, and didn't look back, the version that kept going. Even when everything said stop, Even when home became a story, I had to rewrite from scratch. In the morning, I shipped out 20 orders. One of them was headed to a small gallery in San Francisco, another to a boutique in Toronto. One went to a name I recognized from a board of directors at a major design fund. They were buying not just scarves, they were buying trust, craft, story. And the story they were buying had nothing to do with being someone's daughter, because I wasn't just a success, I was proof. That being discarded doesn't make you worthless. That being underestimated doesn't make you incapable. That being forced to start over is sometimes the only way to start right. A few months after that letter from my father, I got invited to speak at a regional creative business summit. They wanted someone to talk about self-made brands in the slow fashion space. At first, I hesitated. Public speaking wasn't exactly my comfort zone, and the idea of standing in front of hundreds of people telling my story felt too exposed. But Elise nudged me gently, reminding me that if we didn't speak up, someone else would tell our story for us. So I agreed. I wrote the speech over 2 weeks, rewriting every sentence that sounded like I was trying too hard. I wasn't there to impress. I was there to represent every artist who had ever been told their dream wasn't realistic. The day of the summit, I wore one of our earliest pieces, a hand-dyed wrap with uneven edges and subtle flaws. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That morning, the stage lights were blinding and the room silent. I told them about Driftloom, about how it started in silence and doubt. I told them I was kicked out with a suitcase. I told them I had nothing but a stubborn belief that beauty mattered. Even if no one around me thought so, I didn't mention the lottery, not because I was ashamed, but because that wasn't the point. It was a chapter, not the whole story. And besides, the real win was never about the money. It was that I kept going when no one clapped. After the talk, a young woman came up to me in tears. She said her parents had recently pulled funding from her creative writing degree and told her to grow up and get practical. She said hearing my story felt like someone finally held open a door she thought was permanently locked. I didn't give her advice. I just told her she's allowed to build her life on her own terms. Sometimes that's all someone needs to hear. That night, I went home and sat on my balcony. The city lights flickered below, and for the first time in a while, I felt something close to peace. It wasn't a loud victory, but it was solid, and solid meant everything when you've once stood on nothing. The next morning, I woke to an email from a buyer at a major department store. They wanted to carry Driftloom in a curated capsule for the holidays. They were offering favorable terms and full creative control. I reread the email 3 times before forwarding it to Elise and our production coordinator. I didn't scream or jump or text everyone I knew. I just walked to the window, opened it, and let the cold air hit my face, because the moment was big, but I was bigger. Later that week, my mom called, not a voicemail, a real call. I picked up. She said she had seen the summit clip online, that someone from her office had forwarded it. She said, "You looked strong." I didn't say thank you. I just asked what she wanted. She said she didn't want anything, just to hear my voice. For a second, it felt like we were 2 people meeting for the first time. No roles, no past, just distance slowly narrowing. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, with clear terms, my space, my timing. She respected it. When we met, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just quieter. She said something I never expected. She said, "We raised you to be independent, but only if it fit inside our version of success. We never imagined you'd be strong enough to leave and still win." That sentence stayed with me for weeks, because it was the closest she had ever come to admitting they had been wrong. She didn't ask to be forgiven. She didn't beg for a relationship. She just said her piece. And I let her, after that. We began to talk every few weeks, not about the past, not about the money, just normal things. What I was making, what she was reading, small pieces of a bridge that didn't need to be rushed. My father stayed quieter. He sent the occasional email, sometimes forwarding an article about textile innovation with a simple "thought of you." I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't push him either. Not everyone says sorry the same way. The brand kept growing. Elise became creative director, and I started mentoring 2 young designers who reminded me of myself. We launched a studio grant for underrepresented artists. We sponsored a residency at a small retreat in Oregon. We sent care packages to new Etsy shop owners who had just started out. None of it made the front page, but I didn't care because the quiet wins were real. They weren't for headlines. They were for impact. And that's the part people forget. Success doesn't always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it's just walking into your own space, flipping on the lights, and knowing that every stitch, every decision, every hard moment led to this. Not because someone handed it to you, but because you stayed, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The day of Driftloom's first in-house gallery showcase was the kind of day I used to dream about when I had nothing but a plastic sewing machine and a borrowed folding table. We transformed the entire studio into an open-floor exhibit, each corner curated to tell the story of one collection. There were wall panels printed with design sketches, fabric samples arranged like color maps, and a feature corner called The Beginning, where we displayed the first scarf I ever sold, stitched in uneven tension with color that bled a little too much. It wasn't there to impress. It was there to remind. The guest list was selective: journalists, boutique buyers, artist friends, community grant recipients, no influencers, no clickbait press, just people who cared about the craft. Elise was in charge of the flow, and our new event coordinator made sure there was no unnecessary noise. Everything was intentional, clean, honest. 2 hours into the event, I was mid-conversation with the gallery director when I noticed them, my parents, standing just inside the entrance, dressed too formally, looking like they were trying to fit into a room that didn't expect them. I wasn't surprised. Elise had warned me they'd RSVP'd anonymously, probably under a colleague's name. I hadn't told her to stop them. I wanted them to come. I wanted them to see everything they once called a distraction. But on my terms, I walked over slowly, not with confrontation, but with calm. My father spoke first. He complimented the lighting. I let him speak. My mother looked around quietly, taking in the work, the way people moved through the space with reverence. She finally said, "It's beautiful, all of it." I nodded. "Thank you. It was built by people who believed in it when no one else did." She flinched, just slightly. My father looked down at the floor. Then she asked if I could show them around. I said no. I had others to attend to, but they were welcome to stay, to observe, to take it in as guests. I turned away before they could respond, not to hurt them, but to hold my boundary. For years, I had bent backwards for their comfort. That night was mine, not theirs to narrate, not theirs to claim. And that was the moment I realized the power had shifted completely, not out of revenge, but out of reality. They could no longer shape my story. They could only watch it unfold. Later that evening, a woman approached me at the refreshments table. She introduced herself as the program director for an international design residency in Kyoto. She said someone had sent her photos from the event, and she wanted to extend an invitation for a spring residency slot. It would be quiet, immersive, nothing flashy. I said yes before she finished her sentence, because I knew what that space would give me. A pause, a place to create without noise, without legacy following me around. Before the night ended, my parents came to say goodbye. My mother handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check, a donation to the Driftloom Studio grant. No note, no expectations, just an amount that reflected more than money. It was her way of saying, I see it now. I told her the grant was named after Grandma May, the only person who had ever believed in my hands before they proved anything. My father didn't say anything, just nodded and walked away. When the last guest left, I sat on the edge of the showcase platform and took off my heels. Elise came over with 2 mugs of tea. We didn't speak for a while, just listened to the quiet. Then she said, they saw it, all of it. I nodded, but more importantly, I saw myself, because that night wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about making anyone proud. It was about standing inside a space that didn't exist a year ago, surrounded by work that was once just scribbles on napkins, and knowing none of it was an accident. Every corner of that studio was built from hard choices, from late nights, from quiet wins no one clapped for. And every person in that room had felt the weight of doubt at some point. But they came, not for spectacle, for meaning. So when people ask what the turning point was, I don't say the lottery. I don't even say the showcase. I say it was the moment I no longer needed their permission to be proud. When I became the person I used to wait for someone else to believe I could be. There's something no one tells you about becoming the version of yourself you always dreamed of. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with loss, quiet ones, unexpected ones, and sometimes necessary ones. In the months after the showcase, Driftloom grew faster than any of us predicted. We signed with 3 new retailers, launched an education arm that offered free classes to underserved women, and opened a tiny corner store next to a co-op cafe downtown. On paper, everything looked perfect. But beneath the wins, I found myself confronting a different challenge, what it really means to outgrow your old life without becoming unrecognizable to yourself. I started noticing the small shifts first. Old friends who used to call weekly stopped replying, not because they were jealous, but because they didn't know how to relate anymore. One even said, half joking, must be nice to have money solve everything. That stung more than I expected, because behind the success, I still had doubts. I still woke up wondering if this was all going to collapse. I still made mistakes, still struggled with loneliness, still had days where my confidence was paper thin. But to the outside world, I was untouchable, lucky, charmed. They saw the polished photos, the magazine features, the neatly written origin story. They didn't see the nights I sat in silence, wondering if I had built something too fast to carry. I never told the public about the lottery. I never will. Not because I'm ashamed, but because it was never the heart of the story. The money gave me oxygen, but I was already breathing fire long before that. And the truth is, money doesn't protect you from grief. It just buys you better wallpaper to hang over the cracks. Around that time, I got an email from a former coworker at the health tech startup I used to work for. She was sweet, always kind to me, but in the message, she said something that made me pause. "You're so lucky you got to leave." She wrote, "Some of us are still stuck here, waiting for our moment." I stared at that line for a long time. Then I realized the difference wasn't luck. It was risk. I left when there was no safety net. I walked away when it made no sense to. The moment wasn't given to me. I built it, out of scraps, out of silence, out of spite, and most importantly, out of belief. My parents called a few weeks later to invite me to dinner, a real one, not at a restaurant, at home, the same house they pushed me out of. At first, I said no. I didn't want to walk back into a place that once made me feel so small. But Elise said something that stayed with me. You don't owe them anything, but maybe this time you get to walk in with the power. So I said yes. That evening, I drove to the house with a bottle of wine I knew my mother liked, and a linen scarf I had made in a new shade of seafoam she once mentioned loving. I walked in and everything felt the same furniture, same artwork, same cool scent of polished floors, but the energy was different. They didn't look at me like someone they were trying to fix. They looked at me like someone they couldn't quite define anymore. And that was okay. Dinner was quiet but warm. We talked about small things, my work, my father's latest patient case, my mother's attempt at watercolor classes. I watched them try, really try, and I let it be what it was, not a resolution, not a cinematic reunion, just humans learning how to reconnect without pretending the past didn't exist. After dessert, my mother asked if I'd show her how I chose fabric. My father asked if I ever thought about franchising. I smiled, because of course he asked about scale. That's how he shows care. I answered their questions, but I didn't explain myself. I wasn't there to make them understand. I was there to allow them in, on new terms. When I left that night, I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel broken. I just felt clear. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. The girl with the suitcase was still inside me, but she no longer carried the weight of needing to be seen. On the drive home, I played an old playlist I had made in college, back when every lyric felt like a lifeline, and I realized that the biggest revenge was not proving them wrong. It was building a life so right that I no longer needed their permission to live it. 1 year to the day after I stood outside my parents' house with a suitcase and nowhere to go, I hosted Driftloom's anniversary gathering. We didn't call it a party. We called it a showing, not just of work, but of evolution. It was held at the downtown space we had renovated from an old print factory into an open-air studio. The walls were lined with fabric panels from every collection we'd made in 12 months. There were no grand speeches, just stories tucked into the seams. Clients mingled with artists. Past grant recipients stood beside first-time buyers. It wasn't curated to impress. It was curated to honor the journey. That morning, I arrived early, before the lights, before the chatter. Just me, the quiet space, and a cup of strong coffee. I walked the length of the room, touching the edges of the fabric that told my story better than any press article ever could. Each piece whispered something. This one was made when I almost gave up. That one during the first week we hit 1,000 sales. Another stitched the night my father sent a one-line email saying he was proud. The weight of it all didn't crash on me. It landed gently, like something earned, something held. I never thought I'd say this, but my parents came early, not to perform, not to pose. They helped set up chairs. My mom asked if the candles should go in glass holders. My dad offered to help print out name cards. It was so normal it caught me off guard. I watched them move through the space like people trying to understand it from the inside. And for the first time, I let them, not out of grace, out of growth. That night, we unveiled a new piece. It wasn't for sale. It was an installation called Before Dawn. It hung at the center of the room, a long, layered tapestry that started in deep grays and bled into a soft gold. It told my story without words. The night I was pushed out, the rain, the silence, the bus station, the trembling hand holding a ticket I didn't believe was real, the fear, the fire, the rebuild, and the light that came after. It stopped every person who passed it, even my parents, especially them. My mom stood in front of it longer than anyone else. I didn't say a word, neither did she. But when she turned to me, her eyes were glassy, and all she said was, "I see it now." That was enough. Not because it fixed anything, but because it didn't pretend to. That sentence came from someone who no longer needed to be right, only real, after the event. I stayed behind to lock up. Elise had gone home early, exhausted and proud. The room was quiet again, just like it had been that morning. I walked back to before dawn and sat on the bench beneath it. For a while, I just stared, not at the colors, but at what it meant. I remembered the version of me who once measured worth by how many people believed in her. The girl who begged her family to just listen, to just stay open. And I realized she no longer needed to ask for that, because she had given it to herself. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need anyone to apologize the right way, or loudly, or in public. What I needed was exactly what I had built, something of my own, something that couldn't be rewritten by anyone else's version of events. Driftloom wasn't just a business. It was a declaration. That creativity was worthy, that pain didn't have to define you, that starting over wasn't failure. It was the beginning of clarity. So if you're watching this because someone doubted you, someone silenced your voice or made you feel small, I'll tell you what, I wish someone had told me the night I was left on that porch. Sometimes, being kicked out is the beginning of being let in. Sometimes, losing everything is what forces you to build exactly what you need. And sometimes, the real lottery isn't a ticket. It's the moment you realize you no longer need permission to be yourself.